Well, hello, hello, hello. Much love to you all. May God bless you all. Hit the like button. We're going to continue this history series. The first one will pop up at the end of this. A link will be in the description as well, in case you didn't catch it. It is from creation to chaos to the tower, Tower of Babel, of course. Now we start to see the world take shape as we're going to go throughout this from creation to about the 2200 to 1500 BC time where the age of the patriarchs had came about. And it's very important for us as we progress along in this to recognize that we can't truly understand the world around us without understanding the Bible. See, the Bible does not merely give us a record of religious and historical events, it actually provides us with the view of the world that we need to comprehend everything around us, even in this present age. Without understanding what God created, and what happened to his creation, we will never truly understand why the events of the world have played out the way they have. And the world has been shaped by big events that are recorded in Scripture. When we read the Bible, we are introduced to these turning points as well as to God's plan for redeeming creation for his glory. So, we learned about two things: creation, that ultimately led to the fall of mankind, and then the Tower of Babel that we talked about in the last video. So, to touch a little bit here, of course, the fall of mankind. When God created the world, he created it good. It says it from Genesis 1. Each day, after a certain amount of creation he has done, he said it was good. He looked at it and it was good. It was free of problems. It contained everything necessary and it lacked nothing. Adam and Eve were designated as stewards of the earth, to have dominion over things. They had one very simple role. It was to obey God. God wanted them to care for and populate the earth and to stay away from one particular tree. God did not command them to stay away from this tree because the tree was not bad. This tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, was like the rest of creation. It was perfect and without error. Instead, the issue was at stake that Adam and Eve would love God and would express their love through obedience. Would they choose for themselves what they wanted, right? And of course, we know what happened. As we look at the world, it becomes clear that people have sought meaning and purpose through war, materialism, power, prestige, and dominance over others. Yet none of these things ultimately satisfies the human soul. Therefore, the quest continues without any resolution. Mankind has also created all kinds of religions and religious experiences. It is only by looking at the world through the lens of the fall that we can understand why these quests exist and are doomed to fail. And where we look for the solution that will actually work, that's Christ Jesus, of course, in case nobody knows that. So then we get the Tower of Babel. As we have seen, at Babel, humans sought to unite as one and to create a way to God that was based on their own merits and their own standards, but this unity was false because it was not based on being reconciled to God, but on a common faith in self reliance. A lot of the world today still relies on self reliance. See, God intervened. He broke up the unity of the people by giving them, you know, distorting their language of talking to one another. They couldn't understand. And this is the major reason why nations of the world do not get along and why there never seems to be a strong sense of unity amongst one another. If you were to tour all these other nations across the world, you would find culture barriers that exist in ways that people think and process the world around them. Culture differences are seen in a way that families operate, the way children are raised, how weddings and other ceremonies are performed, how music is played, so forth and so on, even how religion is practiced. Even though every human has the same fundamental purposes in life, there is a difference in the way they pursue these and how they're expressed. It is important to remember, however, that these cultural barriers were put in place by God to slow down the rate of rebellion and to keep human pride in check. The only way that these culture barriers can be overcome is by gaining a new life in Christ Jesus. We're going to talk about this man, Abram, who later gets renamed to Abraham in Genesis 17, verse 5. And we see that the world after the flood had once again became established, and this fertile land had been repopulated, and the city of Ur had emerged as a predominant center of life. And archaeologists have uncovered evidence that this city and civilization was a very sophisticated one at that. So this is Abraham's hometown, the town of Ur, which would be the modern day southern Iraq. And they believed in this deity named Nena, and it was the Sumerian moon god. The name of the city is uh, from a variant of the god's name. And the city today is marked by ruins of the great ziggurats of Ur, which contain the shrine of Nana and the center of religious life in the city during Abraham's timeline. Here, sacrifices were offered to this moon god, and taxes and tithes were collected. But during Abraham's life, Ur was the center of a political power in the southeast Mesopotamia. The king of Ur won control of the nearby city Akkada and laid the groundwork for the growth and prosperity in the region. During this time, the ziggurat of Ur was built, and the city became a booming center for commerce and trade, you can say. And Abraham lived in a very developed society. This is what makes his move from Ur to Canaan so remarkable, because he's going to a land that's unknown. Sometimes we have to do an Abraham and we have to step out into a land unknown and just trust God. See, Abraham left Ur during its economic and political pinnacle. It was at the top of its time. And of course, he goes to a rough and undeveloped land. And there's been many excavations that have revealed that the city of Ur was laid out in a rather, we can put, you know, good manner here. Yet the houses were not all what they might expect. Their structure and layout represents rather sophisticated planning, and the houses were engineered in a manner that show attention to space planning, climate control, and functionality. At that, each house had a courtyard in its interior, and in this courtyard was a drain that collected the rainwater into a cistern for storage, which is really interesting. Actually, a lot of archaeology has proved that maybe some of the ancient ways of plumbing and stuff was actually probably better than some places have today. Uh, in some of the wealthy homes, evidence had been found of pipes that distributed the collected water through the house, one of the earliest examples of indoor plumbing. So while the nation enjoyed much technological advancements, it also faced much political strife. During Abraham's youth, Ur faced potential war with neighboring cities of Isin and Larsa. And some scholars have speculated that Abraham's father moved the entire family to Haran to escape this looming conflict in Genesis 11, yet Ur was not the only place in the world that was experiencing significant development at this time. The entire world was making major social and technological advances, and that's where we get now to talk about Egypt. Now we're going to get to talk about Egypt. Although through most of recorded history, Egypt was a unified nation, this was not always the case. And long before Abraham was born, the land that we now call Egypt consisted of two separate kingdoms. You had the Lower Egypt and the Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt was located at the mouth of the Nile River, where it empties into the Mediterranean Sea, and Upper Egypt was located upstream to the south in the higher elevations through which the Nile flows from its headwaters in East Africa. So before this time, um, as we're looking at, Abraham was born. Egypt went through a process of unification that formed the basis for its emergence on the world scene during Abraham's time. When the lower Egyptians ruled, they were their king was distinguished by his red crown that he had on his head, whereas the upper Egyptians were ruled by a king named Narmer, and he wore a white crown. And when these two went into battle, of course, Narmer ended up becoming victorious, and he actually placed the red crown and placed it over the top of his white crown. And this has been a common thing that now in these times Egyptian kings would wear these double crowns. And it was to signify that he was the leader of the entire land of Egypt now. So, this unification of Egypt is important because it marks the beginning of a new period of history. And after all, this is a history lesson. So, there's a lot of debate always between scholars. You have the Christian scholars and the secular historian scholars that talk about this had to be around 2300 BC. And if you remember the other video we did, that's around the time a lot of people place the biblical flood. So, really, this had to happen sometime after that when we're looking at it because the flood destroyed everything. So, most secular scholars date the unification of Egypt at or around 3100 BC. Other conservative scholars, however, suggest that this is probably an erroneous lie based on the ancient list of kings. They argue, like many of them do, they have these debates back and forth. But whatever the exact date of Egypt's unification, it was after this event of King Narmer that unified them that we get the recorded history of hieroglyphs. And the reason why this is so important to the Bible is because, of course, Moses was raised in the ways of the Egyptians, and the ancient Hebrew paleo pictographs was the first form of the Torah read out, and it was in a form that was similar to hieroglyphics. So, this is why this is a very huge step, because this is the first step towards a written alphabet. It is also that during this time that the Egyptians began to formulate their concept of divine kingship of the pharaohs, and it was the era in which the great pyramids were built, is what history tells us, along with many other structures that have fascinated mankind, and we've seen numerous, countless National Geographic, Discovery Channel, History Channel videos on things like this. After the unification of the nation, Egypt became a very rich and powerful kingdom, and we read of this in the Old Testament a lot, that Egypt was a very powerful and rich nation. And this era is often called the Old Kingdom of Egypt, and it was the period in which the Egyptians began to embalm their dead kings and turn them into mummies. The embalming process, the body was cleaned and purified. They would put this natural salt that is used to dry the bones, both inside and out, and then the body's internal organs are removed and placed into these canoptic jars, and then the body is wrapped while a priest reads enchantments, which are believed to protect the individual from evil spirits during the journey to their afterlife. So, this process of embalming was a very complicated one, and only the priests were able to perform this task after king died, his body was taken by the priest to the holy place of the temple to be embalmed. There, the body would be washed with wine and spices, and then the priest would take all the organs out of the body, including the liver, stomach, lungs, and intestines, and cover them with spices to preserve them. The chief priest also removed the hearts and washed it, wrapped it in linen strips, and placed it back inside the dead king's chest. So the Egyptians believed that when the king reached the afterlife, the lowercase g god Osiris would weigh his heart on a special scale. If his heart was good, it would be light, and the king would spend the rest of his time in the afterlife in happiness. But if his heart was full of sin, it would be heavy and it would be devoured by a demon called Amut. Um, Now, after the priests were finished with the heart, they covered the king's body with salt and other spices, as we talked about during this period. The people mourned the death of their king. After 40 days had passed, the priest again uncovered the body and the organs and washed them again with oil and spices this time. At this point, the liver, stomach, lungs, intestines were placed into four jars that they called the canoptic jars, and each jar had an image of a god on its lid. The Egyptians believed that these gods would protect the king's organs. Now, you might be wondering why we're bringing this stuff up. Well, one, how does this fit with history in general? We look at death even through the Bible, and even in today's era, we see that embalming is a process that is still taken. We see that in the American society in particular. You can either be an organ donor or not an organ donor, and these organs are, of course, reused instead of protected with spices and doing enchantments and la da 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 da. You kind of see where the Egyptians started this stuff, and it really has carried through the history of time. And, finally, as we're talking about these Egyptians here, the mummy of the king was placed into three nest coffin. The first was a coffin of gold with the face of the king on the outside. The gold coffin was then placed inside of a wooden coffin to protect it. And finally, the wooden coffin was placed into a sarcophagus located in the pyramid. Before the kings left the pyramid, they put furniture, jewelry, clothes, toys, games, scrolls, and food in the burial chambers so that the king would have things to do and items to make him feel comfortable in the afterlife. As funny as this might sound to a Christian knowing this doesn't happen, this was processes they believe. They believe, well, he needs food, he needs things to entertain him, because after all, he's passed on to the afterlife. He needs these things. So, as we consider the elaborate burial process described, it becomes evident that mankind has always been concerned with such things as life after death, atonement for sin, and judgment for consequences for sins that remain unredeemed. Man's spiritual quest is intense and pervasive, and we see that this intricate process of mummification is an expression of mankind's quest to understand and respond to the divine world. So the pyramids were an important structure and really huge in the central to the belief system of the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptian kings, called pharaohs, believed that they were divine and they were placed into a special place. As we consider the belief system of ancient Egypt, we can see why there was such a power struggle between God and Pharaoh during the time of Moses. If Pharaoh believed he was a divine ruler, then why would he submit to the God of Moses? See, one can easily understand how his ego would be challenged by a call to obey Yahweh, the God of Israel, instead of feeling that everyone needs to obey him and submit to him. So, before we go any further, at this point, we need to return to an observation in Genesis 1:26 where God states that he created man in his image. Therefore, mankind has a stamp of a divine on him. Man is not divine in nature, but bears a resemblance to the divine. So even though Adam and Eve rebelled against God and brought sin into the world, mankind still has a sense of a divine image. The sin of Adam and Eve, at its core, was a sin of submission. They did not want to live within the boundaries that God had established for them. Their rebellion does not mark the end of this quest. Rather, it marks the beginning of mankind's search for the divine outside of the one true God. Why we have so many religions. When we look at ancient Egypt and many other ancient civilizations, of course, we see an illustration of man's pursuit of this upward call of his divine stamp outside of the relationship with the one true God. These questions are asked so many times throughout the history of time. Does God exist? We see these questions pop up all the time. What happens when we die? How do we atone for our sins? Will there be a judgment? Can the eternal dwell with the temporal? Are there rewards for acts done in this life? These are a lot of questions that rise up throughout history of time. And this goes all the way back to the first video we did after the Tower of Babel. We see that God confused languages, put them out. And this is why we see so many culture differences, so many different religions. And really, it always goes back to, of course, the Garden of Eden. So now, Abraham, as we know, Abram, before he was called Abraham, was told to leave this land and go to the land of Canaan. And it was a very, what would have looked like an idiotic move to most people back then, because we've talked about how was a very sophisticated, highly developed land. And the land of Canaan was known for its barbaric people, where they said people ate raw meat and did not bury the dead. Now, saying this, there is no actual real proof that these ancient stereotypes were true, but nevertheless, it was a reputation that people through history have assigned to the land of Canaan. In fact, archaeologists have excavated Canaan and they found that it was marked by a very well advanced agriculture development. Nevertheless, so the land of Canaan was inhabited by the descendants. First, you see here in Genesis 12, it says, I will make a great nation out of you, just like in the Greek. In Hebrew, nation can also stand for a great people. Now, we know in Genesis 10, we see the descendants of Noah. Uh, some of them come right here from verse 15, Canaan, and then you see the Jebusite, the Amorite, the Gerashite, the Hivite, the Archite, the Sinite, right? And the Canaanites, they went through all this land of Sodom and Gomorrah, for instance, as we see here. So Canaan had many tribes that descend from them. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Gerashites, the Hivites, the Amorites were among the earliest inhabitants of the land of Canaan. They were an ancient Semitic people that had roots in Canaan and migrated to Mesopotamia and eventually came back to settle in Canaan, as scripture tells us. So, in terms of political power, Canaan was compromised of a bunch of city states rather than a large political regional power. The industry of each city primarily served itself. So, thus, in this land, remain somewhat a political separate from more of the global communities of Egypt and Mesopotamia that we were talking about beforehand here. Abraham's migration to Canaan took place during the time period that we know as, and as historians have called it, the Bronze Age. So, coming amongst in this Bronze Age, and the reason why it's called this is because it was during this time that bronze began to be used as a metal of choice for everything from pots, pans to weaponry. And as the Bronze Age developed in Canaan, we can see the progressive urbanization of the city state. Canaan was a very fertile, what was very fertile during this time, and the weather was perfect for farming. Actually, we'll have to put a picture up on the screen. Okay, so as you see this picture here, Kanaa had a wide range of landscape. You had the lush hills of Meron, which is in Upper Galilee and northern Israel, as we're looking at here. And you could see why people grew grain, grapes, figs, olives, onions, cucumbers, a bunch of other things. But then you see here, you had these dry desert areas of southern Judah. It was such a vast difference in you had desert, you had green grasslands. This land of Canaan was a lot different. And contrary to the stereotypes of the time, the Canaanites were actually a sophisticated agriculture and urban people. They had inhabited the land for at least 500 years before the Israelites arrived, and they had absorbed many of the features of many of the different cultures of the Near East. One of the more unique advancements that came from Canaan was the alphabet that originally developed in Egypt. Um, we see that the alphabet shifted from a picture based code to a symbol based code. And instead of a picture that illustrated an object or an idea, each letter became a symbol that reflected a sound. And this development took place shortly after the time of Abraham. The Phoenicians, which is now Lebanon, was an ancient civilization located north of Canaan, and it was settled during the time of Abraham and grew into a trading culture. And it did not take long for the influence to spread across the Mediterranean during a period of 1550 to 300 BC. Given the great influence of this region, the development of the alphabet in the Phoenician around 1050 BC had an impact on the entire world. And we still feel this influence today with actually virtually every alphabet of the Western civilization, including Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, and Arabic. And even the modern English alphabet traces its roots from the Phoenician alphabet, which is really interesting. And the Canaanites practice what was called an agriculture religion. At the heart of this religion were fertility rituals. Their main gods were called um, like Balaam, but that would be translated as lords, or their wives would be Bailat, which would be ladies. And you have where we get this form of the Ashtoreth poles that you hear of in the Old Testament. The Canaanites believed that if they pleased their gods, that the gods would send the rain that the people needed for survival. If they displeased the gods, the crops would fail. They believed that following certain rituals, they would be in harmony with the world and the gods of this world. And the rituals they practiced involved immoral sexual practices, the use of sacred temple prostitutes, and a variety of offerings and sacrifices. This was the world of Canaan, the world that Israel would struggle with for years to come. But things were also happening in other parts of the world outside of Mesopotamia and Egypt and Canaan, where international trade starts making its way here. And one of the interesting areas of study in this time period is the progress made in the international commerce. We see that is the act of selling and buying goods and commodities. It has always been obvious reality that more people there um, are to buy an individual product, right? The more people you have, there are to buy all this individual products you have, and the more potential there is to make a profit off of these things. And this is one of the reasons why selling goods outside of one's own community has been a constant pursuit throughout world history and still today. We see this as the world became increasingly more populated, trade grew on a scale that would become a greater force in people's lives than I think a lot of people realize. Some of the easiest methods for transporting goods was by the water back then. And this was especially true in the era when the towns and villages were linked by footpaths rather than well maintained roads like we have nowadays. The first extensive trade routes developed up and down the great rivers. The rivers became the backbone of the early civilization: the Nile River, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus River, the Yellow River. Um, these are some from the earliest times that we see. where these trades centered on the cities that were scattered along these great rivers. They ended up becoming like trade centers pretty much. And as boats became sturdier, coastal trade extended between more distant areas. The Eastern Mediterranean was the first region to develop an extensive um, waterway trade here. First between Egypt and um, and then later ships started making their way to the Phoenicians, which is where Lebanon is. And the Phoenicians were famous not only for the spread of the alphabet among the nations of the world, but also for their luxurious goods that they had. And the Phoenician cedar was exported as the top quality timber for architecture and shipbuilding. And this expensive purple dye was highly sought after throughout most of the known world. The region also became famous for its metal work, particularly in gold. And the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon were known for their glass as well. So now we get to the Bronze Age, where there was interesting advancements in military equipment that happened at this time. One of the most interesting ones was the chariot, known as a fast, lightweight moving vehicle, usually 2 to 3 wheels. The first one appeared in Mesopotamia shortly after the birth of Abraham. And of course, they were symmetrical framework, waist high. They would guard the front and sides. Chariots were primarily used for warfare during the Bronze and Iron Age, sometimes for travel, also for entertainment, sometimes the races of Ben Hur. But they soon got replaced, of course, with military advancements and an evolution of different things like cavalry and tanks, Humvees, where we're at nowadays. And we see that this slowly started dissipating in the time. But another major achievement during this era was the domestication of cats, which is very ironic because by that time Abraham's grandson Jacob was living in Canaan. The Egyptians had trained cats to catch snakes, is what history tells us. And after Joseph, the son of Jacob, was sold into slavery in Egypt, he eventually rose to a position of leadership there and he relocated his entire family to Egypt, as the book of Genesis 39 through 50 gives us a lot of the story. This move was particularly brought about by the family's effort to escape a severe famine that ravaged the Near East, including Canaan. Egypt, under the leadership of Joseph, of course, God was leading the way, was prepared for the famine, and it was an ideal place for them to live. But after Joseph died, there was a leadership change in Egypt. The new king did not like the potential threat of the growing Israelite population that was taking place, so he chose to enslave them. In this dark era for the Israelites stood in marked contrast to the period of literary advancements that was being experienced by the Egyptians during this time. The ancient Egyptian literature had grown out of the religious beliefs, but over time it also came to address topics related to man's ordinary day to day life. Literature held a distinguished position in ancient Egypt, ancient Egyptians' thoughts and civilization. So the ancient Egyptians viewed literature as a source of spiritual nourishment as well as entertainment. And you see where we get today with people get entertainment and religious nourishment out of literature. Writing was an art that was well developed in the Egyptian culture. It took a lot more than we draw on a J or a K. A lot more art was taken with how they made their writings, and the scope of the Egyptian writing during this time was extensive and included such genres as novels, short stories, poetry, folklore, even proverbs, wise sayings, moral teachings, philosophical medications, and literary messages that they were given. So we get into this time now. We're going to get into a little bit of time with Babylon. So we get to Hammurabi of Babylon. And we have a video called America, America, where we talked about some of this guy's laws he placed have a place here in American commerce. And during this time when the Israelites lived as slaves in Egypt, the world was continuing to change and develop in other places as well. Power struggles continued in Mesopotamia. Unlike Egypt, the region was unstable in a constant state of war. Powerful leaders sought to expand their empires through warfare and enslavement. Over time, cities were conquered and various empires arose. So in 1792 BC, a king named Hammurabi inherited the throne of Babylon. And at first, he ruled over a small area of the land. Immediately surrounded, there were surrounding cities around him. Over time, however, he began to conquer other small cities and these cities around there. And eventually, he used his leverage and his growing power to convince other cities to swear allegiance to him in order to avoid bloodshed. And soon, Hammurabi ruled over the entire southern part of Mesopotamia, and it was during his reign that the region received the name Babylonia. And he also was a very unique ruler because he did not use his military strength as a force to convince people to follow him. After gaining control of a region, he sought to establish rule of law that would govern his empire. He taught that the chief god of Babylon, Marduk, had established his throne and had given him the power to rule in the purpose of treating people fairly. So he developed 282 laws that brought order to this empire, known as the Code of Hammurabi. And it is considered one of the earliest set of written civil codes that has ever been found in archaeology. The scope of these codes applied to everyone in the land, whether rich, poor, free, or enslaved. For instance, 1, if a man kills another man's son, his son shall be cut off. If anyone ensnares another for a crime which he cannot prove, then he that ensnared him shall be put to death. If someone cuts down a tree on someone else's land, he shall pay for it. If anyone brings an accusation of a crime before the elders and does not prove what the charges are, he shall, if the capital punishment or if the capital offense is charged, be put to death. If a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls and kills the person, for instance, evidently something that was happening a lot back then the builder shall be put to death, right? But if the owner's, but there was another part of this code that if the owner's son dies, then the builder's son shall be put to death instead. So, son for a son, right? If a son slaps his father, his hand shall be cut off. If a robber is caught breaking a hole into a house so that he can get in and steal anything, he shall be put to death in front of that hole. If anyone steals the young son of another, he shall be put to death. If anyone is careless when watering his field and he floods someone else's field by accident, he has to pay for the ruined grain. If a man strikes a pregnant woman, thereby causing her to miscarry and die, then the assailant's daughter shall be put to death. If a man puts out an eye of another man, his eye shall be put out as well. At the core of all these codes is the execution of justice. And this man believed that the best way to rule a nation was to establish laws that preserved and protected justice. And you kind of see where we talked about this a little bit in one of the other videos. But one of the ways that justice was enforced was by following a principle that was later called a Latin word for the law of retribution. And honestly, we kind of see some of the laws in the Old Testament relate to some of these things. But, what would make a king so desirous to ensure that justice shall be prevailed, right? Well, the Bible tells us that we're in the image of God. We talked about this in that other video. And since we're in the image of God, as Genesis 1:26 through 27 says, one of the attributes of God is justice. And we get through all this stuff that has happened. And we get to a reflection here towards the end of this little study that during the time of Abraham and his descendants, the world continued to experience major developments that had shaped all societies ever since, including ours today. Egypt became a superpower. Canaan developed a lot of agriculture, and Hammurabi established a society run by laws based on serving of justice. And even the Phoenicians with the alphabet it has developed into where we're at today. We see humans using the skills that God gave them to subdue the world, not always giving credit to the Creator, though, as Scripture tells us, but we also see that wars, conflicts, and misery that was brought from the fall in the garden have been brought into the world from the start of time till now. Even as God divided the world into different regions and people expressed themselves in different culture manners, we still see man's quest for a meaning and a purpose that they're never going to find, even with their attempts to deal with sin and establish justice, if they don't find their way in Jesus Christ. Because the world has truly taken shape in the way that it has went. But there will be a new world that is going to be ruled in a millennial reign by the one true king who will bring actual justice. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hit the like button on the way out. Hopefully, we can get to part 3 at some point in time. This one took me a little bit of time. Still want to work on more of the wisdom series we're working on too. Only so much daylight within a day that we can get things done. So may God bless you all. We fight from victory, not from defeat. And that is thanks to King Jesus.